Straight-jacketing sprang to every lock and bolt. Shadowy figures shocked, wall, ceiling, hat, coat, trousers flung from him, vest, woolens. Maurice was plunged into a steaming bath. Half suffocated he sank, his assailants gesticulating. A keystone reel gone crazier. The terror-peeling celluloid, whirling the figures into vapor, dissolved them. All was void.
So Austin Clarke is an Irish poet, a kind of forgotten Irish poet really in a way, born in 1896 and died in 1974. He's really representative of a lost generation of poets who were overshadowed by Yeats's brilliance and sort of the public acclaim that surrounded his work, and in some ways he dominates that period, whereas Austin Clarke is much less well known, but I think representative of particularly of that group. And the poem that I teach on the course is a long narrative poem, and it is about a personal experience. It's a poem about memory, but it's also about the loss of memory. And for Clarke, in this particular poem, Mnemosyne Lay in Dust, it is about recovering something very dramatic that happened to him when he was a young man. In 1919, he suffered a mental collapse or breakdown and spent a year in hospital, in St. Pat's Hospital in Dublin. And the poem he writes much, much later. That happened in the early in the 20th century. But the poem isn't published until 1966. So he's looking back at it from a very mature point of view and trying to reconstruct that period from memory, even though it's about the loss of memory. So it's a really interesting thing that he's trying to do in the first place. And the poem takes us from his home through the streets of Dublin into St. Patrick's. And it's on St. Patrick's Day. And it's a really important thing for him that it's St. Patrick's Day, because everybody else is celebrating being Irish and who they are and their identity. And his big fear is that he's lost his identity, that he no longer knows who he is. He tells us in that opening sequence that hasn't slept for 6 weeks. He's afraid to sleep, and yet he needs to sleep. And the thing that he's most afraid of is what he calls himself the loss of self. You could reconstruct the journey now into what was at that time a very forbidding and frightening building with 10-foot high blackened walls with large iron gates, as he says, that they clang behind him. And it becomes virtually a prison for him for that year. The body of the poem, the full centre part of the poem, is about the madness itself and how that increases from the moment he gets into the hospital. It doesn't get any better. In fact, the very things that he fears on his way to hospital happen the minute he gets there. He's plunged in a scalding bath, his clothes are taken from him, and he becomes delirious. And so the rest of the poem is a mixture of nightmare, hallucination, varied with tiny pieces of lucidity, tiny periods of lucidity, until we get towards the end of the poem when we begin to see some return of sanity, or as Clarke calls it, memory, being selfed again. And we find the final section of the poem then is very brief and you could think unconvincing, where he tells us that he is remembered, and he splits the word. So he's put back together. And he takes the journey out of the hospital along the same streets again and back home. So this is what the poem captures. It's a narrative poem. It tells a story, and the beginning and the end of the poem you can understand perfectly. The centre of the poem, I don't suppose you're meant to, because what he's trying to reconstruct from memory is loss of memory and loss of self. And he tries to articulate that as best he can through, as I say, hallucination, through dream, and also through paranoia. He talks about moments of extreme paranoia when in his little, as he calls it, cell, he watches his soap dish and he thinks people have moved it in the night, even though there's been nobody in his room. So we have this complete loss of self, and this is the thing he's really interested in. The poem even gives you a hint of that, because Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, but she's also the mother of the muses. So it's both things. I think for a poet to lose his sense of who he is must be terrible, because it's out of that you write. So he loses not just his sense of who he is, but he loses everything that he does in that one period. The experience of the hospital itself was beyond horror. It's very difficult to write a long narrative poem that holds your attention, that is cohesive. And Clarke proves that you can actually do that by tracking his consciousness through the streets of Dublin, into the hospital, and then that journey, that descent into madness and insanity, which he captures, I think, in an extraordinary way.
Among the imbeciles was Mr. Radcliffe, mahogany-skulled, molarless, with 2 paws, spoon-fed on pap. When he was teased or slapped, he howled, "Holy St. Francis, stop it, stop it."